Someone saying that it's nice to have things that kind of complement each other in the kitchen, so the basil and the tomato also growing alongside each other. Because that's where, if you think about the diversity or the origin, right, of that cuisine and the way where those plants, you know, would have first started to be cultivated is together. So I'm sure you all know about the ability for beans, the legume family, to capture atmospheric nitrogen. So they have this relationship with the bacteria in the soil that allows them to draw in nitrogen. So beans capture nitrogen, and then kale, the brassica family is really nitrogen thirsty. You think of like how much green leaf growth they produce. So they're a great sort of companion planting example. And then just to sort of also highlight, you may have heard these different terms, the interplanting, intercropping, polyculture, companion planting. They all are kind of referring towards the same thing of like planting different plants together, right? So a polyculture is something that is mimicking the diversity of natural systems, opposite to monoculture, if you just think about it like that. And it can often be, the polycultures I've seen are kind of more towards that permaculture ethic, so they're a bit more kind of like, they're rich and they're colourful and they're sort of packed in. They're not necessarily, polyculture isn't necessarily they're not very easy to harvest, perhaps. They're not very, if you're not, the reason why we don't do that much polyculture here is because it's such a training ground, and then we get loads of different volunteers weeding and planting here. Polyculture is an absolute minefield for people, like, well, what's a weed? What do I pull out? What do I, you know?
You have to know the whole system.
Yeah. So, whereas the interplanting, cropping tends to be sort of fewer plants, so the kale and the bean example. And that is purely, mainly focused on increasing the yield and thinking about how those two things can work together.
I would also say for polyculture, like you said, is a very permaculture sort of way. It's untidy. If you're a tidy person, it's really hard to actually allow or put different things together. And we're so used to seeing nice neat rows, things like that, whereas nature doesn't do things like that.
Yeah, exactly.
And then other people think it's neglected, don't they?
Yes. I know.
So following on from that, because one of the main reasons why people companion plant is to think about insects, whether that's bringing pollinators into your cropping area, or whether that's to try and ward off aphids and different pests. Have you found any of these in your gardens, growing spaces?
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm sure I can give you access to this presentation afterwards, but this is just quite a useful chart to think about how you encourage more of these into your garden, or less of them. I think spiders are often a really underrated insect, actually. I really welcome them at home because they keep a lot of fly populations. We get lots of fruit flies in the summer, and the spiders have a feast.
I'm surprised they're linked to slugs. That's interesting. Spiders,
Slug eggs, they'll eat slug eggs,
So a bit about woodlice, about how good and bad they are.
Yeah.
Is there a sort of trade-off in a way? They're good for breaking down
exactly.
stuff, aren't they?
I think this is the same conversation with slugs, you know. They are the kind of like decomposers of the world, you know, so having them around to some degree is really essential. We don't have that much of a slug problem here because when we walk around later I'll show you, we've got quite a lot of big established ponds here which encourage all of those natural predators, the frogs, the newts, the dragonflies, all of that life that keep the slug population in check. So, a couple of ways of creating habitats for these really needed insects. I always say that ponds are like the absolute top. You know, if you can provide a bit of water is life. So if you can provide some form of it, whether it's in a pot pond or in a little dish. I've got a very small garden at home, so mine is just like in a very shallow tub. But in the summer months, particularly in June when it was boiling hot, you know, all of the insects were going for it. And yeah, bug hotels. I don't know if you've built bug hotels, but they do need, important thing to mention about them is that they do need refreshing every year. So when the insects come and lay their eggs, they tend to bung up the bamboo sticks, so that, and then when the larvae hatch, they like burrow their way out. But it is important to refresh the material that you filled the bug hotels with. And then the dead hedge, I'll show you the epic dead hedge we've got here. It sort of stretches along the whole Friendship Park Road, and it's been an amazing habitat for invertebrates and small animals. It's also acted as a bit of a sound barrier actually for the road, which is something I wasn't expecting, but it's really nice. And yeah, one of the guys who teaches here, something he said that really like flipped my sort of approach to pests and disease was, he was like, how do you overwinter your pests? Because if you can overwinter your pests, then you overwinter your predators. And in that early spring, when you know everything's starting to waken back up again, if you've overwintered your pests and your predators, then everything kicks back much quicker, rather than populations having to kind of boom and burst in response to each other. Last summer we had a massive aphid outbreak on our tomatoes, and it was so bad. We were going around a couple of the worst ones with washing liquid spray and squishing them. It was so bad, and I was thinking, oh, how, and you're like, do I buy kind of like a box of live ladybirds, and it was because the previous years, so I've been here now nearly 2 years. So that first summer, nothing had been grown in that polytunnel for the best part of like 2 years, more than that. So I think it's just that it didn't have any like life in there at all. And then I just had to hold my nerve really, and then the ladybird population boomed in response to the aphids, and the aphids then were in check, and there was loads of little ladybird larvae crawling around. At the start of the year, when you start like planting your food plants out, your aphid population, say, let's take that as an example of the pests, are quicker to get in there. They're quicker. They're really fast reproducers, so their like population explodes really easily. And then your predator population, the ladybirds, is much slower to respond to that. So in that window, your plants are like very vulnerable, yeah, and have been knocked back. This often happens with like the broad beans, because aphids or black fly often go for broad beans. So if in some way you can look to provide habitat and shelter and food plants and so on for your pests, so for your aphids or for your caterpillars or whatever it is that you might really struggle with the most. If you can overwinter your pests, therefore you can overwinter your predators, your ladybirds, and
so you keep the populations kind of high-ish
yeah,
all the time.
keep them bubbling along.
Keep them bubbling along
over the winter.
Both of them, and by keeping your pest population fed, you keep your predators for the pests there.
Exactly.
And then neither populations drop. Got you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank
and
you.
then in the early spring,
yeah.
they both
There's
can
no
increase,
they
and
can
there's
both
no
increase